We talked a little about self-talk.
Mm-hmm.
There are people that say that, no, I did affirmations and I swear by it. It absolutely was the thing that allowed me to get out of the pleasure trap.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so how do you,
There's no reconciling that. We don't know what's actually going on inside that person's mind. In other words, we're only aware of what arrives in consciousness, but what's actually happening is the mind is a very deep machine, and it has algorithms, and those algorithms give rise to what your thoughts and feelings are. In other words, your thoughts and feelings aren't anything you choose.
They're not random.
Right, and so it's possible that somebody, essentially had a lot of motivation to change, was intending to change.
And also did some affirmations.
And then also happened to do affirmations. And so the correlation coefficient between doing the affirmations and doing the change came together, and they blamed the affirmations.
Yeah.
When the truth is it was actually an entire complicated underlying motivational system that actually drove their success.
And that kind of confusion will happen often because people are trying to change a lot of things at once. When people are making changes in their lives, they kind of have this tendency to want to go
Mix
to
up
this
which one
whole
did it.
overhaul. So yeah, there's this whole correlation.
So really it was doing
problem.
well. They did an affirmation.
Yeah, and you had some momentum, and the momentum was giving the internal audience some feedback. The internal audience is like a momentum calibrating machine. It's saying, it's like how big is the little snowball of success that you're building here toward this big competitive goal that you have? And so they're feeling good, and they're linking it to the affirmation. But the affirmation is never, that piece of mail is never actually getting to the internal audience as they think that it is. It's just part of the whole mix.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So let's talk about trauma a little bit. Emotional eating is something that's commonly discussed as a problem, as a hindrance toward getting out of the pleasure trap and getting everything going. Can you talk about that a little bit? I know you're giving a discussion here this weekend on that topic, so
Sure.
I'd love to hear your summary.
Well, one of the problems in the world is that we have to define things if we're going to have a reasonable discussion. So emotional eating is a term that covers a fairly wide ground of motivation. So someone can say, I just had a really tough day at work and I just feel like eating a corn dog. Okay, so that's what I feel like doing. That's emotional eating. There's sort of two different ways to look at the concept of emotional eating, two different perspectives. One of them is going to be that the reason why I do some self-sabotaging things consistently over time is because I've got emotional issues that have their roots back in much younger years. And those drive me to comfort foods, etc., some soothing the wounds that are within me. So that's sort of the big...
Grandma's cookies.
Yeah, grandma's cookies, because when I was a kid, I had these bad things happen, but that was a place that I could be safe, etc., etc. So that's one major argument about emotional eating or in trauma theory that sits in one place. Another thing just sits in place of, hey, I'm overwhelmed. You know what I mean? I've just been through 3 hours with the boss, and I'm just fried, and I just feel like eating a piece of pizza. Okay, that's sort of a different thing. And so the second
self-medication.
Yeah, there's strangely enough, there's probably two very different ways of looking at number two. So one way to look at number two is that you're to consistently battle the natural instincts to go for the richest food in the environment.
It takes some energy.
It takes some energy, and it takes some organization. And so if you have been thrown off of your organization by a bunch of stress pressures, and you are also thrown off in terms of mentally, in other words, you've now invested a great deal of mental energy and you're under tension, then you've got less energy and resources to essentially direct to this constant ongoing push that we push against the pleasure trap. So that makes sense to me. Yeah. There's another version that's very interesting, and that is that remember our two friends, the internal audience and the self. And the self feels the pressure of perfection or excellence. It's feeling the expectations of the internal audience. The internal audience, as I say, is essentially a moral system that is telling the self, you're doing a good job, you're working well, etc. Well, when we have been through a lot of stress today, for example, or this week, or this month, what the self will oftentimes it feels the pressure of those expectations from the internal audience, as it should. It's a system that's designed by nature to be, having to basically make very intelligent long-term cost-benefit decisions for its behavior in the village. And so it might want to be self-indulgent, but it will cost it. That's why you have this internal audience saying, don't do it. Don't steal grandma's cookies. You know what I mean? Even though you'd like to, because they're going to start asking who did it, and you're going to have crumbs on your face, and you're going to lose some status in the village if you did it. So that's why you've got this internal audience, is sort of a constant pressure on you to perform well. The self, if it's actually been performing well and it's been under a lot of stress, it will sometimes try to negotiate with the internal audience and say, come on,
it's only fair.
It's only fair after the week that I've just been through. Isn't it only reasonable
and
that I would...
having this conversation about an addictive substance.
Yes.
Whether it's food or alcohol or anything else. I mean, this is an unfair battle.
Yes, and so it's a very interesting problem that, for example, with alcohol, people that struggle with this, they have done a great job and they've been through something very difficult, and they'll have the self start to negotiate with the internal audience. The internal audience has been sending them nice esteem signals about how well they've been doing in keeping this under control and doing an excellent job. And the self will say, thank you, isn't it time that I take a day off?
Yeah, I cash in my paid time off.
Paid time off. And so that's another...
So you mean it as more of like a celebration of success?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Which can totally throw you down.
Celebration of success that's buffered by this stressful event. This kind of, it can be a success, like I've earned it because I did something really great, but it can also be like, just really been through a hard time and cut me some slack.
Is that like a desire to feel good when you feel good with the pleasure trap things when you're feeling bad?
It doesn't have to be feeling bad. It could be just, you could be just tired.
The trauma version.
Yeah, the trauma version is a little different. So remember, these two versions we talked about are not trauma version. This is just overwhelmed, don't have the energy to push against the pleasure trap, and I indulge. Completely understandable.
Just the limits of the nervous system dealing with the super normal stimuli of the pleasure trap.
Right. Second version is the self starts negotiating with the internal audience and basically says, hey, isn't it time?
Oh, yeah, I think we've all been there. Yeah.
And it's exactly that kind of process, believe me, this kind of process is exactly what would go on in the Stone Age village about, hey, if I've been working really hard and I've been working twice as hard as everybody else in the village, isn't it reasonable, guys, that I take a little break today?
Sure.
And they would say, of course.
Sure.
Okay? And so it's only reasonable that we would see the self perk up its little argumentative head and basically file a claim to take a day off. And that is exactly the internal dialogue. So that's a second version of emotional eating.
I feel that one sometimes when I'm like working really hard.
Yes.
Not food related. And I'm like, damn it, I've worked how many hours this week?
Yeah.
Can I just do a little less today, make one less video?
But you're authentically trying to, this is a very earnest attempt of the self to truly convince the internal audience, which the ego trap is a little more of a bluff. It's a little more like everybody knows that this is a lie and a facade, and that's why the ego trap feels bad. So this is like an actual, real attempt at persuasion that the self is making on the internal audience, and the internal audience is briefly convinced. Like, if this works, the internal audience is like, all right, you've earned it. But then it's like it only lasts for so long.
Right. And because it would be completely reasonable, for example, let's suppose that you're somebody that works out really hard. And you wake up one morning and you don't even know why, but you're a little off. Maybe you got a cold coming and you can't see it yet. Okay? Or maybe you're just a little bit short of sleep, or for whatever reason, you're a little run down. And the self says to the internal audience, who's expecting you to do this excellent thing for 90 minutes every morning at 5 a.m.
Like, not today.
It says, isn't it reasonable that I take a day off?
Yeah.
And the internal audience can say, yes, it's reasonable.
Given the evidence, that is reasonable.
And it is reasonable.
It's totally reasonable.
But that's a different problem than walking into the pleasure trap.
Yeah. Because it's not a supernormal stimuli. It's a legitimate claim on a legitimate injury.
The pleasure trap sucks you back and puts a hook in your mouth behind a trap.
Yeah.
That's what makes that emotional eating a dangerous little issue, is because it isn't that it has to be such dynamite, but it can be. Okay? And that's one reason why, quote, emotional eating is a legitimate threat to humans. That's different than trauma. Trauma is it's the notion that who you are and the struggles that you're having and the contortions and difficulties that you are having with addictive processes have to do with buried and unprocessed traumas that took place to you in childhood or any other time. This is just a fallacy. It's just this was dreamt up in the late 1800s, probably before by other people if we look back in history. But we know, because we've got records, in the late 1800s, in and around Vienna, this was a commonly held notion about why some people had really bizarre, or not bizarre, but just really disturbed personalities. Like they were super, super anxious, or they were very irritable, or they were just very unstable and would get all upset. They would call those hysterics, okay? i.e. hysterectomy. It was females. It's basically hysterical females.
High emotional females.
High emotional females.
Which obviously something must have gone wrong to make them this way. They couldn't have just been born that way, because other women aren't like this. So
right.
We're looking at the situation, and it seems like, and their mothers are also kind of similarly probably kind of hysterical. So it's a logical inference that Freud and others are making around this time, that something is interrupting the otherwise natural process of who these women were supposed to be to take them off the path, and it's some sort of trauma story.
Right, and so this very interesting idea. Freud becomes the standard bearer of this. He grabs a hold of this for very interesting reasons, probably several different reasons. One of them
Somewhat
is it was lucrative.
Yes.
Okay. In other words, it turned out he was struggling making a living. He was in debt. And it turned out that this idea had a lot of fire to it.
Yes,
okay,
not intellectually pure.
Right. It has a right. It wasn't it isn't something he noticed to be true. It's something that he smelled was hot. And it turns out it's so hot that it is stood up and is still a dominant concept in the world today over 100 years later, even though it has been completely obliterated by the scientific evidence. So he did not notice this. People do not notice it. They think they notice it because it's a theory that seems to have great intuitive appeal. And so it also, incidentally, has something else, which is that if you're a person that's struggling, and you can't figure it out, and you're embarrassed, and you have a community level ego trap, and you have an internal level ego trap, and it makes you feel bad about yourself because you can't stand up to, and you're quitting, what a beautiful thing to be handed to you.
Beautiful excuse.
Yeah, it's a beautiful excuse. And so I'm not saying that this is consciously calculated excuses. I'm saying that it's extremely comforting to be given a pass.
Very comforting, and after you've done it a few times and you realize that this can be used as a pass in this way, then people are going to be more likely to fall into that dynamic when they're struggling and need to preserve their esteem in that way.
Yeah, it turns out this is not how trauma works. Trauma is actually, if you talk to any cognitive psychologist that actually studies memory function and you actually talk to legitimate scientists in neuroscience, the way it really works is that trauma and its implications for later on are extremely narrow. This is the entire point of having memories, is to have memories to be highly specified to coach you into the future when very similar events that come up that may be threatening. So if you have a near-miss auto accident, you don't get afraid of going on planes or buses. Okay, you only are afraid there in situations that start to speak like that. Okay, you can see what a disaster it would be for example, a rabbit to have a near miss with a fox behind the left to the south of its rabbit hole, and then never go over there again, and then pretty soon not go anywhere near any bushes because it's all seemingly related and had similar sensory characteristics.
And just as much of a disaster if it suddenly becomes terrified of anything that might even slightly resemble a fox.
Right.
It's like everything's similar, and so it never leaves its rabbit hole again, and it starves to death, and it can't feed its rabbit pups. So either misdirection of this trauma memory is going to be disastrous for the species.
What actually happens is that what quote trauma is, if we translate it into legitimate terms, it's just a quote significant event. Okay, if we take that word away, because that word has magic for the last 100 years, we instead translate into English, and that is it could be a very significant event or a very significant series of events. The system should remember very significant events. And it will, but it's going to turn out that most of the time people aren't thinking about these issues for years. It's only when they get into a therapist's office and they start struggling with the pleasure trap and they can't figure out what's going on, that now we start talking about all this stuff.
The therapist prompts them, is there anything in your childhood that might be linked to this behavior that you're experiencing today? And like,
So
well,
it
come to think of it, like actually there is.
Sure.
And then they're getting that esteem from the therapist, and it's just a mess.
So what happens right then?
Yes.
Is that now giving them an excuse to carry on with, for example, a pleasure trap?
Sure.
If that's what it is.
Of course it does.
Could be. I mean,
Yeah,
if they're looking at the situation and
Yeah.
they like, I can't solve this problem. They've been in the pleasure trap for a while. They've tried. They've made efforts, and it's just not happening. They're having a real dilemma there, and they're going to be looking around at these other ways of looking at it and preserving their status.
You're right. What Jen just said is like really the crux of this, and it's very interesting. And that is that we're so interested in what other people think of us. It's the most important thing that there is for humans. If you're a Wolverine, that's not true, because it's one Wolverine per 50,000 acres. It's you against nature and your kids.
Oh, yeah.
But for human beings, we always lived in groups. And you needed to have very, very good standing in groups. And so you're constantly trying to demonstrate to the
Small
village
groups.
that you are solid, okay? That you're a member worth saving if there's a problem. And so if you are falling short of some significant expectation, then we desperately want to have an excuse. That excuse will cover us. It's essentially keeps our insurance policy in place. So people that struggle with the pleasure trap, whether it's drugs, alcohol, food, etc., any of these pleasure traps, they are fundamentally, they're not just traps in themselves. They're also embarrassing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
They're very embarrassing.
It's also like, what's wrong with you that you have this problem? And a beautiful explanation is somebody else did something to me 30 years ago.
I would if I could.
But I happen to have a handicap that you don't have. That's why I have this problem. Okay, that is an extremely attractive explanation, and as a result, it's an entire industry. Okay, this is what this is. And it's
what psychology is.
That's what psychodynamic psychology is.
Why do people feel relief? You're not getting out of the trouble.
Because it's status preserving. This is the point. They feel the relief that I'm safe in the village. I'm not going to be kicked out of this coalition. Like my status, my reputation are intact. This is. I mean, he's talked before about how Weight Watchers is sort of works on the same principle, that if you are stuck in the pleasure trap and you're not making the progress that you would want to be making, you can wave around your Weight Watchers card at work, and it's like, see, I'm trying. I'm trying. It's the same. That's another kind of status preserving mechanism. This is the same kind of principle. It's just being deployed a little differently.
Yeah.
But it's protecting your potential as a member of the village. That if you could do this, if you were freely allowed to do it, but something is blocking you from accomplishing this goal, whether it's something that happened in the past or something unfair about the present. So it's a very, very tempting kind of little trap to fall into when you're dealing with an intimidating competitive problem.
Yes, and the
pleasure trap is as intimidating as it gets. I mean,
I have
stuck there.
Yeah, we have nothing but compassion for the
Yeah.
pleasure trap, and we understand the internal mystery that people actually live with this. The ego trap, they don't understand. The internal version, the external version, the negotiation of the self with the internal audience over taking a break. These are all like really fairly complicated and relatively newly recognized psychological dynamics.
Yeah.
The person just knows that they are stumped, they are beaten up, they can't manage, they're stuck,
Stuck's the word you want to say.
they're in trouble, and they're embarrassed. And so as a result, if someone will come along and tell you, you poor thing, this is not your fault, this is somebody else's fault.
And it's a person in a position of authority, it's a psychologist, it's a doctor, and
they weave an enticing and superficially interesting and possibly plausible narrative
It all
that
sounds
was
plausible.
good enough to sell the world for the last 100 years.
Yeah.
But it's not true.
Yeah.
The real problem is that the pleasure trap is way underestimated. Therefore, the world sets very high bars. In other words, the world basically thinks that it shouldn't be that hard. The world, and therefore the internal audience, sets too high bars. So therefore, we set up
Eat
ego
less,
traps.
move more. You know,
Right.
it's like this. How hard could it be?
It's not easy. It's exceptionally difficult. You're pushing against the past masters of the survival arts.
That's really what you're
The
doing.
most stable, most successful biological chemicals on Earth are DNA. Okay? They have been here for 3,500 million years. They are exceptionally good at engineering organisms in order to survive. And they have built systems in animal brains to make them relentlessly go for the richest, most convenient food in their environments. That is like survival instinct number one.
It's the only past trauma that matters is the starvation of all of your ancestors that condition these genes to be relentless in searching the richest food in the environment. That trauma is what has created you this way.
Yes.
But that's shared with the species.
Yes.
That's not special to you.
And that's why this problem, you can see it in any lab. All you have to do is put any animal of any species in there and have them make these choices, and they will never want to go back to normal food. So you're going to see that this is what we're trying to explain is you can explain the pleasure trap very easily, and therefore it seems like the prescription to get out of it is relatively simple.
No problem.
Therefore it shouldn't be a problem, so you should just do it.
No.
This is like you're trying to essentially unlock a very, very expensive safe and you don't know the combination. Okay? That is really more what the pleasure trap is like. The fact that some people have been successful doesn't mean that any given individual should expect to be successful. You could expect that this is going to be a very tricky, difficult journey with a great deal of short-term failure. But just like anything else, there's a learning curve. But if we actually miss important fundamentals and we get dragged off into alternative explanations for the psychological dynamics that are incorrect, we're going to be chasing all the wrong clues, and we're not going to solve the mystery. That's why we're talking about these things. Jen is an absolute expert in trauma motivation. So her doctoral dissertation at Harvard involved this deeply.
You've got to drop it in.
I've got to drop it in there. I spent an hour before I said it.
It's
We waited.
It's
We
improving.
waited.
The point is,
we've gone from 10 seconds to an hour, so it's good.
This is, but this is what it is that we're attempting to do, is to try to really delineate carefully what these internal challenges are and try to keep people focused
on the process.
On this very simple thing that's you have to watch for it in order to get it.
So subtle. It's such a quiet little voice, but it's such a sustainable little voice that feels so solid once you've tuned into it. But it's very subtle, and it's way quieter than that external state, which is the drug that everyone's chasing.
So when someone has experienced trauma, they even if they have an understanding of the pleasure trap and everything, what is the best move for that person to deal with the trauma, to make sure that it's not going to throw them back into the pleasure trap? What's next instead of
the issue is the trauma has nothing to do with your dynamics with the pleasure trap. It's not related.
Or your dynamics with most of anything.
No, it's just not. It turns out that the actual impact of trauma on future behavior in humans is very similar to what you'd expect with a broken arm. So if you were traumatized, broken arm at 7, people will forget that they even broke their arm when they're in the doctor's office at 47, talking about having a physical. Okay. Then when they take an X-ray and they're like, "Oh, it turns out you had an arm break." "Oh yeah, I forgot." Okay.
Or your kid breaks their arm,
Right.
or you're having a conversation about broken arms. This all sort of like summons the memory, and
There's
it brings
files
it
in there.
It pulls that file forward.
But it's not important in your day-to-day life. The same thing is true of even fairly horrific traumas that take place in childhood. They're not important and germane to the situations that people are in on a day-to-day basis, and the files are not being pulled up, and they're not relevant. The notion that a bad thing that happens to you is like a termite that is in there eating away at your existence and your potential of happiness is actually a completely mistaken understanding.
Or that it's somehow invisibly in your body directing disease processes or anything like this.
No.
This is all
it's just not true.
No evidence
it's
for any
equivalent
of
the broken arm.
Yeah.
In other words, while it's hurting and while you're compromised, it hurts and it's bad. Okay? Once the hurt goes away and it's gone and we're out of the dangerous situation, it's gone. Now the memory is there to warn you. So let's suppose some kid that I wrestled with when I was 7 years old broke my arm. And I told him, "Uncle," and he broke it anyway.
Oh,
okay?
little bastard.
I'll never forget that guy. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I'll also never forget the feeling of being in a wrestling match with a disagreeable human.
Yeah.
So these are things that, and also if I had a child and I saw my kid in a wrestling match with a disagreeable human, I would look to intervene because the files inside my head would say that's
files.
a bad situation. But it's not in my interactions with my boss, with my spouse, with my children, with the pleasure trap, with my painting and my sculpture. It's not interacting with anything.
Not directly, not in some sort of causal pathological way, but what you're getting at with that is that there can be bad information. You can make inferences based on a traumatic experience about what that means about all men, for example. So if you're abused by your stepfather and you never basically rewrite that file with other experiences in your life, you can be going around with bad information that can affect your life choices. But in the vast majority of cases, people are going to be accumulating new life experiences, accumulating new data, and basically resolving that initial distortion that was associated with that experience just by living their lives.
So really the best therapy for someone who's experienced, like, such as a loss in family, is to really just be explained that you're supposed to be in pain right now.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's going to cause your I don't know, guard to come down a little as far as your, say,
it's not going to
pleasure
feel
trap
good.
habits.
Yeah.
But you got to wait it out, and
Yeah.
you're going to be...
And that it's not doing any permanent, invisible,
Right.
ephemeral damage to the self, and it's not going to make you more likely to be an alcoholic or to be obese or any of these things. So
is just that realization enough for most people to just be like,
I think so.
Oh,
I think it's very
okay.
liberating when most people hear this. Like,
Actually,
oh my God, I'm not carrying around this damage for the rest of my life from what happened to me when I was a kid or a teenager. Like, it's profoundly liberating for people.
Yeah, it can be. It can also, depends on the individual. So I've had people come up to me today, as a result of my little discussion about this yesterday, that were grateful. That like, hey, I thought maybe I was damaged, but you're telling me I'm relieved that I'm not.
Yeah.
Okay? On the other hand, I'm sure there's individuals that are frustrated because I just pulled their excuse card.
Yeah, now what do I do? Now you're telling me that it is my fault, and I still can't solve this problem because the pleasure trap is still intimidating as hell and I can't get out of it. So, well, what am I supposed to do now?
And the answer is, sorry, the pleasure trap doesn't play fair.
It does not play fair.
This is not a problem that the human being was designed for, and so a great many human beings will never be able to get out of it. And that sort of goes against our grain.
It's something we don't want to hear.
It's like un-American. You know what I mean?
It's anti-blank slate thinking. We want to think that we can resolve any kind of problem. It is anti-American.
Right, but it's actually accurate.
Yeah.
Okay, and once we understand that is actually the truth, because the problem is unnatural. Okay, so because it's unnatural, it is not surprising that a great many human beings cannot solve it. They don't have the tools
to solve it.
It takes unusual intelligence, unusual conscientiousness, and unusual motivation. Okay, it takes a lot of frickin' force to go against.
It's really
system.
hard, even for the people that have those
It's really hard. That tells you just how high the challenge is, and the challenge gets worse by the year because the geniuses in New Jersey are actually watching people's brains on PET scans while they're eating
how can
alternative.
We make this even more super normal?
In other words, they're
this is
working.
what they call the bliss point.
Yes.
Like, let's engineer that food to be even more unfair to humans.
And that's what it is. So it's your Stone Age brain, and all of the stressors that we have in negotiating this very difficult, slippery problem against corporate America.
Yeah, so it's really, there's no surprise that people are stuck in
and
this trap.
no shame.
And no surprise that they are looking to try to draw some kind of connection to childhood experiences and to sort of involve something that looks like an excuse to preserve this status in the face of this problem because it's profoundly
embarrassing,
destructive and embarrassing.
Right.